psychology of scarcity. Why feeling poor changes your brain. And welcome. Today, we're exploring the psychology of scarcity and how feeling poor literally changes your brain. Whether you're fully focused right now or simply letting this play in the background while you work, rest, or even drift off to sleep, your subconscious mind is listening. The gentle frequencies woven into this audio are designed to quietly reprogram your relationship with money and abundance. So there's no need to concentrate. Just relax. Let the words and frequencies do their work. Your mind will absorb what it needs. Imagine two people sitting in identical coffee shops, ordering the same drink. One person barely glances at the price before ordering. The other person has already calculated the cost against their remaining budget for the week, considered whether they could make coffee at home instead, and felt a small knot of anxiety as they handed over their card. Same coffee, same price, completely different internal experiences. This difference isn't about the actual amount of money in their bank accounts. It's about something far more fundamental, the psychological state we call scarcity. And what we're discovering through modern neuroscience and behavioral psychology is that this state doesn't just influence our spending decisions. It literally rewires how our brains function. The person experiencing scarcity isn't just thinking about money differently. Their brain is processing information differently, making decisions differently, even perceiving time and risk differently. The neural pathways that govern attention, memory, and planning are all shifted into a different mode of operation. This isn't a character flaw or a lack of willpower. This is human neurology responding to perceived threat. And understanding this distinction changes everything about how we approach financial stress and decision-making. Over the next hour, we're going to explore how scarcity creates what researchers call cognitive tunneling, a narrowing of mental focus that can trap people in cycles they never intended to enter. We'll examine how the stress of not having enough literally consumes mental resources, leaving less cognitive bandwidth available for the kind of long-term thinking that could improve the situation. We'll look at why people experiencing financial stress often make choices that seem counterproductive from the outside, and how these patterns can persist even after circumstances improve. Because once your brain has learned to operate in scarcity mode, it doesn't automatically switch back to abundance mode just because your bank balance changes. This understanding isn't academic. It's deeply practical. Because when we recognize scarcity as a psychological state rather than just a financial condition, we can begin to address it at its source, in the patterns of thought and perception that either perpetuate it or transform it. Section 1. The Scarcity Mindset. When less becomes everything, let's start with a fundamental question. What exactly is scarcity, and how does it differ from simply having less money? Scarcity, as psychologists define it, is the subjective feeling of having insufficient resources to meet our needs. Notice the word subjective. Two people with identical financial situations can experience completely different levels of scarcity. One might feel abundant and secure, while the other feels constantly under threat. This subjectivity is crucial because it reveals that scarcity is as much about perception as it is about objective circumstances. The pioneering research of Senthil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir, documented in their book Scarcity, demonstrates that when people feel they don't have enough of something, whether it's time, money, or any other resource, their cognitive function changes in measurable ways. They conducted experiments where they artificially created scarcity conditions for participants. In one study, they had people play a game similar to Angry Birds, but with a twist. Some participants were given abundant shots to complete each level, while others were given very few. The participants with fewer shots, the scarcity condition, showed increased focus and performed better initially, but they also showed decreased performance on subsequent cognitive tasks. The scarcity group's brains had become hyper-focused on the immediate challenge, but this intense focus came at a cost. Their ability to think broadly, to plan ahead, to consider multiple options simultaneously, all of these higher-order cognitive functions were diminished. This is what happens in the brain under scarcity. Imagine your mental capacity as a computer with limited processing power. When scarcity kicks in, it's as if a resource-intensive program starts running in the background, consuming RAM and slowing down all other operations. In real life, this might look like someone spending hours researching the cheapest possible option for a purchase, even when their hourly wage makes that time worth more than the money they might save. From the outside, this appears inefficient. But from the inside, the brain under scarcity is doing exactly what it's designed to do. Hyper-focus on the immediate resource constraint. The problem is that this hyper-focus creates what researchers call tunneling. When we tunnel, we become incredibly attentive to the immediate scarcity, but we lose sight of everything else. We might save $5 on groceries but miss an opportunity to earn $50 because we weren't mentally available to notice it. Think about someone who's constantly worried about money. They might check their bank balance multiple times a day, carefully track every expense, and feel anxiety about purchases that are well within their means. Their brain has learned to treat money as a scarce resource that requires constant monitoring. But here's where it gets interesting. This same person might be completely careless with their time, even though time is arguably more valuable than money. They might spend hours in lines to save a few dollars, or accept a low-paying job that requires a long commute, because their scarcity tunneling has focused exclusively on money. This is cognitive tunneling in action. The brain becomes so focused on one type of scarcity that it creates blind spots everywhere else. The neuroscience behind this is fascinating. Brain imaging studies show that when people are thinking about financial problems, the same regions light up as when they're experiencing physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex and the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, areas associated with distress and threat detection, become highly active. But more importantly, areas associated with executive function, the prefrontal cortex regions responsible for planning, working memory, and cognitive flexibility, showed decreased activation. It's as if the brain's alarm system is so loud that it drowns out the brain's planning system. This isn't a design flaw. In true emergencies, this response is exactly what we want. If you're being chased by a predator, you don't want to be thinking about your 5-year plan. You want every cognitive resource focused on immediate survival. The problem is that in modern life, financial stress can trigger this same survival response, but the threat isn't immediate or temporary. It's chronic. And a cognitive system designed for short-term crisis management becomes maladaptive when it runs continuously. Consider Maria, a single mother working 2 part-time jobs. Every morning, she wakes up and immediately starts calculating. Rent is due in 10 days. She has enough for rent, but that leaves very little for groceries. If she takes the overtime shift this weekend, she can cover groceries, but she'll need to find childcare. Before she's even gotten out of bed, Maria's brain is already running the scarcity program. Every decision throughout her day will be filtered through this calculation. Should she buy the name brand cereal her daughter likes, or the generic version? Should she drive to the farther grocery store where things are cheaper, or save time and gas by shopping closer to home? Each decision requires cognitive resources, and because her brain is already running the scarcity program, she has fewer resources available for other types of thinking. She might miss noticing that her daughter seems withdrawn lately. She might not see the job posting for a better position that a friend mentioned. She might make a small mistake at work because her attention was divided. None of this is Maria's fault. Her brain is doing exactly what human brains have evolved to do under conditions of resource scarcity. The problem is that the modern world can create conditions where this adaptive response becomes a trap. This is why understanding scarcity as a psychological state, not just an economic condition, is so important. Because once we understand the mechanism, we can begin to work with it rather than against it. Section 2. Cognitive bandwidth. How worry consumes mental resources. Let's dive deeper into this concept of cognitive bandwidth and understand exactly how financial stress affects our mental capacity. Imagine your mind as a smartphone. When you first turn it on in the morning, it's running smoothly. Apps open quickly. You can switch between tasks easily. Everything feels responsive. But as the day goes on, you have more apps running in the background. Your phone starts to slow down. It takes longer to load new applications. Sometimes it freezes entirely. This is exactly what happens to cognitive function under financial stress. The worry about money runs like a background application, constantly consuming mental resources, even when you're not consciously thinking about it. Researchers measure this phenomenon using something called cognitive load theory. Just like a computer has limited processing power, our brains have limited cognitive bandwidth. And when a significant portion of that bandwidth is dedicated to processing financial stress, there's less available for everything else. The studies demonstrating this are remarkable. In one experiment, researchers had participants complete cognitive tests, both before and after being prompted to think about a major financial expense. The group that was primed to think about money showed significantly decreased performance on tasks requiring working memory, attention control, and fluid intelligence. But here's what's particularly striking. The decrease in cognitive performance was most pronounced among participants who actually had financial concerns in their real lives. For people who were financially secure, thinking about a hypothetical expensive purchase was just an abstract exercise. But for people already dealing with financial stress, even briefly focusing on money was enough to measurably impair their cognitive function. This helps explain a phenomenon that many people find confusing: why individuals experiencing financial hardship sometimes make decisions that seem to worsen their situation. From the outside, it might seem obvious that taking on high-interest debt is a poor choice, or that spending money on small luxuries when struggling with basic expenses is counterproductive. But when we understand cognitive bandwidth, these decisions make more sense. The person making them isn't stupid or irresponsible. They're operating with diminished cognitive resources, which affects their ability to think through long-term consequences, resist immediate impulses, and process complex information. Think about decision fatigue, the well-documented phenomenon where our ability to make good decisions deteriorates throughout the day as we make more and more choices. Now imagine that instead of decision fatigue building up over the course of a day, you start each day already partially depleted, because a portion of your cognitive bandwidth is constantly dedicated to financial worry. This is the daily reality for millions of people. They're not starting from the same cognitive baseline as someone who doesn't carry financial stress. They're beginning each day already at a disadvantage when it comes to mental clarity and decision-making capacity. The research on this is extensive and sobering. Studies of farmers in India, whose income varies dramatically between harvest and pre-harvest seasons, show that the same individuals score significantly lower on cognitive tests during the financially stressful pre-harvest period. Their IQ scores, as measured by standard tests, drop by an average of 13 points. 13 points. That's the difference between average intelligence and superior intelligence, or between average intelligence and borderline intellectual disability. The same people, with the same brains, performing dramatically differently, based solely on their current level of financial stress. When the harvest comes in and financial pressure eases, their cognitive performance returns to normal. This isn't about education, intelligence, or character. This is about the direct impact of scarcity on cognitive function. The mechanism behind this is what psychologists call intrusive thoughts. When we're worried about something important, our brain periodically interrupts whatever else we're doing to remind us about the worry. This happens automatically, below the level of conscious awareness. If you've ever tried to focus on work while dealing with a personal crisis, you've experienced this. You'll be reading a document or listening to a meeting, and suddenly your mind drifts to the problem. You pull your attention back, but a few minutes later, it happens again. Gosh. For someone dealing with chronic financial stress, this interruption cycle happens constantly. They might be helping their child with homework, but part of their attention is calculating whether they can afford the field trip fee. They might be at work, but their mind keeps drifting to the credit card bill that's due next week. Each interruption is brief, maybe just a few seconds. But these interruptions happen dozens or even hundreds of times throughout the day, and each one requires cognitive resources to process the worry and then redirect attention back to the current task. The cumulative effect is like trying to work on a computer that's constantly running virus scans in the background. Everything takes longer, everything requires more effort, and the overall performance is significantly degraded. This explains why financial stress affects so much more than just financial decisions. It affects parenting, work performance, relationships, health choices, and virtually every other area of life. Because all of these areas require cognitive resources, and those resources are being partially consumed by the background program of financial worry. Consider David, an accountant who's struggling with debt. At work, he's responsible for managing complex financial data and making calculations that affect his company's bottom line. But while he's trying to focus on his clients' books, part of his mind is running calculations about his own finances. Can he afford his car payment this month? Should he ask his boss for an advance? What happens if his car breaks down? These thoughts don't just distract him. They consume the same type of cognitive resources he needs for his work. He's trying to do financial analysis, while his brain is already running a financial analysis program in the background. It's like trying to run two resource-intensive applications simultaneously on an old computer. The result is that David makes more mistakes at work, takes longer to complete tasks, and feels mentally exhausted by the end of the day. His supervisor might interpret this as laziness or incompetence, not realizing that David is essentially working with a cognitive handicap. This cognitive burden also affects learning and adaptation. When our mental bandwidth is consumed by immediate concerns, we have less capacity for the kind of abstract thinking that leads to creative problem solving or long-term planning. Someone dealing with financial stress might know intellectually that investing in education or skills development could improve their long-term prospects. But their cognitively overloaded brain struggles to plan and execute these longer-term strategies. The immediate demands feel too urgent to allow for future-focused thinking. This creates a cruel irony. The very time when someone most needs to think strategically about improving their situation is when their cognitive capacity for strategic thinking is most impaired. Understanding this isn't about making excuses for poor decisions. It's about recognizing that cognitive bandwidth is a real, measurable resource that affects decision-making quality. And just like any other resource, it can be managed more or less effectively. When we understand that financial stress literally impairs cognitive function, we can begin to design strategies that work with this reality rather than against it. Section 3. The stress response loop, when survival mode becomes permanent. Now let's examine how chronic financial stress creates a self-perpetuating cycle that can be incredibly difficult to break, even when circumstances begin to improve. When our ancestors faced scarcity, a failed hunt, a harsh winter, a drought, their stress response was perfectly adapted to the situation. Cortisol and adrenaline would flood their systems, sharpening focus, increasing physical strength, and prioritizing immediate survival over everything else. Once the crisis passed, hormone levels would return to normal, and regular cognitive function would resume. But modern financial stress doesn't work like this. Instead of facing an acute crisis that resolves quickly, many people live in a state of chronic low-level financial threat. The stress response system, designed for short-term activation, becomes chronically activated. This chronic activation has profound effects on both brain structure and function. Prolonged exposure to stress hormones literally changes the brain. The hippocampus, crucial for memory formation and learning, can actually shrink under chronic stress. Meanwhile, the amygdala, responsible for fear and threat detection, becomes hyperactive and enlarged. What this means in practical terms is that someone living with chronic financial stress becomes increasingly sensitive to potential threats while simultaneously losing some capacity for learning and memory formation. They might become hypersensitive to any sign that their financial situation could worsen, while finding it harder to remember and integrate new information that could help improve their situation. Dr. Robert Sapolsky's research on stress physiology shows that chronic stress doesn't just affect how we feel. It affects how we think, how we learn, and how we perceive the world around us. The brain under chronic stress becomes biased toward threat detection and short-term thinking. This creates what we might call a survival mode of operation. In survival mode, the brain prioritizes immediate needs over long-term planning, certain outcomes over uncertain ones, and familiar strategies over novel approaches, even when the novel approaches might be more effective. Let's consider Sarah, who's been struggling financially for several years. Her brain has learned to operate in survival mode. When she gets her paycheck, her first instinct is to immediately pay the most urgent bills and buy necessities. The idea of setting aside money for an emergency fund or investing in something that might pay off later feels impossible, even dangerous. From a purely logical standpoint, building an emergency fund would improve her financial security. But her brain, operating in survival mode, interprets any delay in meeting immediate needs as a threat. The thought of having money sitting in savings while bills are due triggers the same stress response as a physical danger. This isn't irrationality. This is a brain that has been trained by experience to prioritize immediate survival over long-term optimization. And the longer someone operates in this mode, the more entrenched these patterns become. The stress response loop works like this. Financial pressure creates stress. Stress impairs cognitive function. Impaired cognitive function leads to decisions that may worsen the financial situation. Worsened financial situation creates more stress, and the cycle continues. But there's another layer to this loop that's even more insidious. Chronic stress doesn't just affect decision-making in the moment. It affects learning from experience. The stressed brain has difficulty forming new neural pathways and integrating new information. This means that even when someone in financial stress encounters information that could help them, a new job opportunity, a financial strategy, a resource they hadn't known about, their stressed brain may not be able to properly process and retain this information. Think about trying to learn a new skill while you're extremely anxious. The anxiety doesn't just make it harder to focus in the moment. It actually interferes with the brain's ability to form the neural connections that represent learning. The information doesn't stick the way it would if you were in a calmer, more receptive state. This is why simply providing financial education to people in financial stress often isn't effective. It's not that they don't want to learn or that they're not capable of learning. It's that their chronically stressed brains are not in an optimal state for learning and behavior change. The stress response loop also affects perception of time and risk. Under chronic stress, the brain becomes increasingly focused on immediate concerns and increasingly unable to accurately assess long-term probabilities. Someone in survival mode might know intellectually that education or skill development could improve their earning potential over time, but their stressed brain experiences the time and money required for education as immediate threats to survival, while the potential benefits feel abstract and uncertain. This time distortion is measurable. Studies show that people under financial stress consistently overestimate the likelihood of negative events and underestimate the time it takes for positive changes to manifest. They become pessimistic not by choice, but as a result of how chronic stress affects neural processing. Consider Marcus, who's been unemployed for 8 months. Early in his unemployment, he was optimistic and strategic. He researched companies, customized his resume for each application, and even considered going back to school for additional training. But as months passed and rejections accumulated, his brain shifted into survival mode. Now, he applies for any job that might provide immediate income, even if it's not a good fit for his skills or career goals. The idea of taking time to develop new skills or being selective about opportunities feels like a luxury he can't afford. Marcus's brain has learned that immediate action feels safer than strategic patience, even when strategic patience might lead to better outcomes. His stress response system is treating job searching like an emergency, which paradoxically makes him less effective at the kind of thoughtful, strategic job searching that tends to produce the best results. The cruel irony is that survival mode thinking often produces the very outcomes it's trying to avoid. By focusing exclusively on immediate threats, it can miss opportunities and make choices that increase long-term vulnerability. But understanding the cycle also points towards solutions. Because if chronic stress is what maintains these patterns, then anything that reduces stress, even temporarily, can begin to break the cycle. This is why small improvements in financial security can sometimes produce disproportionately large improvements in overall life outcomes. It's not just the money itself, it's the reduction in chronic stress that allows cognitive function to improve, which enables better decision-making, which can lead to further improvements in a positive feedback loop. The key insight is that the stress response loop isn't a character flaw or a permanent condition. It's a normal response to abnormal circumstances. And like any learned pattern, it can be unlearned and replaced with more adaptive patterns when the right conditions are created. Section 4. Decision-making under pressure. Why smart people make poor choices. Let's explore one of the most misunderstood aspects of financial psychology. Why intelligent, capable people often make financial decisions that seem obviously counterproductive to outside observers. The conventional wisdom suggests that poor financial decisions result from lack of knowledge, lack of willpower, or lack of intelligence. But the research tells a very different story. It shows that decision-making quality is heavily influenced by the conditions under which decisions are made, and that financial pressure creates conditions that systematically impair judgment. Consider the phenomenon that behavioral economists call present bias, the tendency to overvalue immediate rewards relative to future rewards. This isn't a character flaw, it's a predictable quirk of human psychology that becomes more pronounced under stress. When someone is not under financial pressure, they can relatively easily choose to save money today for a benefit that will come later. Their brain can hold both the present cost and the future benefit in working memory simultaneously and make a rational comparison. But when someone is under financial stress, their cognitive bandwidth is already partially consumed by worry and threat monitoring. This leaves less mental capacity for the kind of complex temporal reasoning required to accurately weigh present costs against future benefits. The result is that future benefits get systematically undervalued, not because the person doesn't understand their importance, but because their cognitively loaded brain can't hold both timeframes and focus simultaneously. This explains why someone struggling financially might choose to pay a higher price for something they can afford today, rather than save up for a better deal tomorrow, even when they intellectually understand that waiting would be more economical. Their brain, operating under cognitive load, experiences the immediate option as concrete and certain, while the future option feels abstract and risky. Dr. Anandi Mani's research demonstrates this beautifully. She studied sugarcane farmers in India who experienced dramatic income fluctuations between harvest and pre-harvest periods. The same farmers, making the same types of decisions, showed markedly different decision-making patterns, depending on whether they were in their high-income or low-income period. During the pre-harvest period, when money was tight, farmers were more likely to make decisions that prioritized immediate needs over long-term optimization. They might choose to buy lower-quality seeds that were cheaper up front, even though higher-quality seeds would produce better yields. They might delay maintenance on equipment, even though preventive maintenance would be more cost-effective than emergency repairs. But during the post-harvest period, when financial pressure was reduced, The same farmers made more future-oriented decisions. They invested in better seeds, maintained their equipment properly, and planned more strategically for the following year. This wasn't because the farmers learned new information between seasons, or because their values changed, or because they suddenly became more intelligent. It was because their decision-making was operating under different cognitive conditions. The implications of this research are profound. It suggests that many of the financial behaviors we attribute to poor character or lack of education are actually predictable responses to cognitive stress. Take the phenomenon of poverty taxes, the higher costs that people with less money often pay for basic goods and services. Someone with limited cash might buy food in smaller quantities, paying more per unit. They might use check cashing services instead of banks, paying fees for basic financial transactions. They might buy lower quality items that need to be replaced more frequently. From the outside, these choices seem obviously inefficient. But from the inside, they make perfect sense for a brain operating under scarcity conditions. The person buying food in small quantities isn't failing to understand bulk pricing. They're making a rational decision based on their current constraints. They might not have enough cash to buy in bulk, or storage space to keep bulk purchases, or confidence that they won't need that money for something more urgent before they consume the bulk purchase. Similarly, someone using check cashing services isn't necessarily unaware that banks would be cheaper. They might not have the documentation required to open a bank account, or the minimum balance required to avoid fees, or the ability to wait for checks to clear when they need money immediately. These decisions are rational responses to the constraints and cognitive conditions created by scarcity. The problem isn't the decision-making process, it's the conditions under which the decisions are being made. Understanding this distinction is crucial because it shifts our focus from judging individual choices to understanding the systems and conditions that influence those choices. Let's consider another common pattern: the tendency for people under financial stress to focus on managing existing debt rather than building wealth. Someone might diligently pay down credit card balances while contributing nothing to retirement savings, even when the retirement savings would provide better long-term returns. From a purely mathematical perspective, this might not be optimal, but from a psychological perspective, it makes perfect sense. Debt feels like a threat that requires immediate attention. The stress of carrying debt consumes cognitive bandwidth and creates urgency around elimination. Retirement savings, on the other hand, feels abstract and distant. The benefits are decades away, while the psychological relief of debt elimination is immediate. For a brain operating under stress, the immediate psychological benefit often outweighs the abstract financial benefit. This isn't short-sightedness, it's a predictable response to how stress affects temporal reasoning and risk perception. The research also shows that financial pressure affects not just individual decisions, but decision-making processes. People under financial stress tend to consider fewer options, spend less time evaluating alternatives, and rely more heavily on mental shortcuts or heuristics. This makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. When resources are scarce, spending a lot of time deliberating about choices is a luxury that might not be affordable. Quick decisions, even if they're not optimal, might be better than slow decisions that miss opportunities or fail to address urgent needs. But in the modern financial world, this quick decision-making style often backfires. Financial decisions often benefit from careful consideration, comparison shopping, and long-term thinking, exactly the kinds of cognitive processes that are impaired under stress. Someone under financial pressure might take the first job offer they receive, even if waiting and continuing to search might lead to a better opportunity. They might accept the first loan they're approved for, even if shopping around could save them money. They might choose the most familiar option rather than researching alternatives that could be more beneficial. None of these are inherently bad decisions. In some contexts, quick action is exactly what's needed. But when this becomes the default decision-making style because of chronic stress, it can lead to consistently suboptimal outcomes. The key insight is that decision-making quality isn't just about intelligence, knowledge, or values. It's also about the cognitive and emotional conditions under which decisions are made. And financial stress systematically creates conditions that impair decision-making quality. This understanding opens up new possibilities for intervention. Instead of focusing solely on financial education or willpower training, we can focus on creating conditions that support better decision-making. This might involve reducing immediate stressors, providing decision-making support, or designing financial products and services that work better for people operating under cognitive constraints. When we understand that poor financial decisions often result from cognitive conditions rather than character flaws, we can begin to design solutions that work with human psychology rather than against it. Section 5. Breaking Free. Rewiring your brain for abundance. Understanding how scarcity affects the brain is only the beginning. The more important question is, how do we break free from these patterns and rewire our neural pathways for abundance thinking? The encouraging news is that the brain's plasticity, its ability to form new neural pathways and modify existing ones, means that scarcity thinking isn't permanent. Just as the brain can learn patterns of scarcity, it can also learn patterns of abundance. But this rewiring requires specific intentional practices that work with the brain's natural learning mechanisms. No. The first principle of neural rewiring is that new patterns must be practiced under conditions of safety, not stress. This might seem obvious, but it's often overlooked in approaches to financial change. Trying to develop new financial habits while still operating under intense financial pressure is like trying to learn to swim while drowning. The stress itself interferes with the learning process. This is why the most effective approaches to breaking scarcity patterns often begin with creating small pockets of psychological safety, even before addressing the underlying financial situation. This might involve building a small emergency fund, securing stable housing, or simply having a plan that reduces uncertainty about immediate needs. The goal isn't to solve all financial problems immediately. That's often not realistic. The goal is to create enough psychological breathing room for the brain to shift out of survival mode and into learning mode. Consider the concept of cognitive rest. Just as physical muscles need rest between workouts to grow stronger, cognitive systems need rest from chronic stress to develop new capabilities. For someone whose brain has been running the scarcity program constantly, learning to create periods of mental rest is a crucial first step. This might involve meditation, spending time in nature, engaging in activities that produce flow states, or simply practicing the art of not thinking about money for designated periods of time. The specific activity matters less than the principle, giving the overworked stress response system time to reset. Research on neuroplasticity shows that the brain consolidates new learning during periods of rest, not during periods of intense activity. So these rest periods aren't just psychologically refreshing, they're neurologically necessary for rewiring to occur. The second principle involves what neuroscientists call attention training. The brain under scarcity develops a hyperfocus on threats and problems. Breaking free requires deliberately training attention toward opportunities, resources, and possibilities. This isn't about positive thinking or denial of real challenges. It's about rebalancing attention so that the brain notices the full spectrum of available information, not just the threatening aspects. One practical approach is what we might call abundance scanning. This involves deliberately looking for evidence of resources, opportunities, and support in your environment. Not creating false evidence, but noticing real evidence that the scarcity-focused brain typically filters out. For example, someone might practice noticing people who are willing to help, skills they possess that have value, opportunities for learning or growth, examples of people who have improved their situations, or moments when they feel secure rather than threatened. The brain has a tendency to notice whatever it's trained to look for. If it's trained to look for threats and scarcity, that's primarily what it will see. But it can be retrained to notice abundance and opportunity with equal facility. This retraining happens through repetition and practice. Each time you deliberately notice an opportunity instead of a threat, or a resource instead of a limitation, you are strengthening neural pathways associated with abundance thinking. The third principle involves temporal rebalancing, helping the brain regain its ability to think across different time horizons. The scarcity brain becomes trapped in immediate timeframes. Breaking free requires gradually expanding temporal perspective. This might start with very small extensions of time horizon. Instead of thinking only about today's needs, practicing thinking about this week's possibilities. Instead of focusing only on current problems, spending time envisioning preferred outcomes. The key is to make this temporal expansion gradual and manageable. A brain that's been focused on survival can't immediately jump to thinking about 5-year plans, but it can gradually learn to hold longer time horizons in awareness. One effective technique is what we might call future self visualization. This involves spending time regularly connecting with a mental image of your future self who has successfully navigated current challenges. Not fantasizing about unrealistic outcomes, but connecting with the version of yourself who has learned, grown, and developed greater capability. This practice helps the brain begin to orient toward growth and possibility, rather than just threat management. It activates neural pathways associated with planning and goal-directed behavior that may have been dormant during periods of intense stress. The fourth principle involves decision-making practice under low-stakes conditions. The brain needs to relearn how to make decisions from a place of abundance rather than scarcity. But this relearning is best done with small, manageable decisions rather than major life choices. This might involve practicing choosing based on preference rather than just necessity. If you're buying groceries, occasionally choosing an item because you enjoy it rather than just because it's cheapest. If you're planning your day, including something that brings you pleasure rather than just addressing obligations. These small practices help the brain remember that it has choices and that decisions can be based on values and preferences, not just survival needs. Over time, this decision-making style can be applied to larger and more significant choices. The fifth principle involves community and connection. The scarcity brain often operates in isolation, feeling like it must solve everything alone. Breaking free usually requires reconnecting with sources of support, whether that's family, friends, community organizations, or professional networks. This isn't just about practical support, although that can be important. It's about the psychological shift that happens when the brain stops operating as if it's alone against the world and starts operating as part of a larger network of relationships and resources. Human beings are inherently social creatures. Our brains are designed to function within communities, not in isolation. When we're connected to others, our stress response systems naturally regulate more effectively, and our cognitive function improves. The final principle involves gradual expansion of comfort zones. The brain that is operated under scarcity often develops very narrow comfort zones as a protective mechanism. Breaking free requires gradually expanding these zones, but in a way that feels safe rather than threatening. This might involve taking small risks, trying new approaches to familiar problems, or gradually increasing tolerance for uncertainty. The key is to make these expansions small enough that they don't trigger the stress response system that would interfere with learning. Each small expansion of comfort zone creates new neural pathways and increases the brain's confidence in its ability to handle novel situations. Over time, this builds the psychological flexibility that's necessary for navigating complex financial decisions and opportunities. And it's important to understand that rewiring the brain for abundance isn't about denying real financial constraints or pretending that positive thinking alone will solve practical problems. It's about restoring the brain's full cognitive capacity so that it can respond to financial challenges with creativity, clarity, and strategic thinking rather than just survival reactions. When the brain is operating from abundance rather than scarcity, it makes better decisions, notices more opportunities, builds stronger relationships, and develops more effective strategies for improving circumstances. This isn't magic, it's applied neuroscience. The transformation from scarcity to abundance thinking is possible for anyone, but it requires patience, practice, and often support from others who understand the process. The brain that has learned to operate in scarcity mode didn't develop those patterns overnight, and it won't abandon them overnight either. But with consistent practice of these principles, the neural pathways of abundance thinking can become stronger than the neural pathways of scarcity thinking. And when that happens, financial behavior naturally begins to align with long-term well-being rather than just short-term survival. Summary: understanding the psychology of scarcity. As we come to the end of our exploration, let's synthesize what we've discovered about how feeling poor changes the brain and what this means for anyone seeking to improve their financial well-being. We began with the recognition that scarcity is as much a psychological state as it is an economic condition. Two people with identical financial circumstances can experience completely different levels of scarcity based on their perception, their past experiences, and their cognitive patterns. This understanding is liberating because it means that changing our relationship with money doesn't require waiting for our external circumstances to change first. While practical improvements in financial situations certainly help, the psychological experience of scarcity can begin to shift even before the numbers in our bank account change. We explored how scarcity creates what researchers call cognitive tunneling, a narrowing of mental focus that can trap people in cycles they never intended to enter. When the brain perceives scarcity, it hyperfocuses on the immediate resource constraint, but loses sight of everything else. This tunneling effect explains why people under financial stress often make decisions that seem counterproductive from the outside, but make perfect sense from the inside. The concept of cognitive bandwidth helped us understand that worry literally consumes mental resources, leaving less capacity available for the kind of strategic thinking that could improve the situation. We saw how the same individuals can perform dramatically differently on cognitive tests, depending on their current level of financial stress, with differences as large as 13 IQ points. This isn't about intelligence or character. It's about the direct impact of stress on cognitive function. Understanding this removes judgment and blame from the equation and allows us to focus on creating conditions that support better decision-making. We examined how chronic financial stress creates a self-perpetuating cycle where survival mode thinking becomes the default operating system. The brain under chronic stress becomes biased toward threat detection and short-term thinking, making it harder to learn new information and develop new strategies. This stress response loop explains why simply providing financial education often isn't enough. A brain operating under chronic stress isn't in an optimal state for learning and behavior change. The stress itself interferes with the cognitive processes required to integrate and apply new information. We also explored why intelligent, capable people often make financial decisions that seem obviously counterproductive to outside observers. We saw how financial pressure creates conditions that systematically impair judgment, not through lack of knowledge or willpower, but through the effect of stress on decision-making processes. Understanding that poor financial decisions often result from cognitive conditions rather than character flaws opens up new possibilities for intervention. Instead of focusing solely on education or willpower training, we can focus on creating conditions that support better decision-making. Finally, we examined how the brain's plasticity means that scarcity thinking isn't permanent. Just as the brain can learn patterns of scarcity, it can also learn patterns of abundance. But this rewiring requires specific, intentional practices that work with the brain's natural learning mechanisms. The principles of neural rewiring, creating psychological safety, attention training, temporal rebalancing, decision-making practice, community connection, and gradual comfort zone expansion, provide a roadmap for transforming our relationship with money from the inside out. The most important insight from all of this research is that the experience of scarcity is not a permanent condition or a character flaw. It's a normal response to certain conditions that can be changed when we understand the underlying mechanisms. This understanding brings both compassion and empowerment. Compassion for ourselves and others who struggle with financial stress, recognizing that these struggles often reflect cognitive conditions rather than personal failings. And empowerment from knowing that these conditions can be changed through understanding and practice. When we understand how scarcity affects the brain, we can begin to work with our psychology rather than against it. We can design financial strategies that account for how stress affects decision-making. We can create support systems that address both the practical and psychological aspects of financial challenges. And most importantly, we can recognize that improving our financial well-being isn't just about changing our external circumstances. It's also about changing our internal relationship with money, scarcity, and abundance. The brain that operates from abundance rather than scarcity makes better decisions, notices more opportunities, builds stronger relationships, and develops more effective strategies for navigating financial challenges. This transformation is possible for anyone willing to understand and work with the principles of how the mind creates our financial reality. As you continue forward, remember that every moment of awareness, every small practice, every choice to respond from abundance rather than scarcity is literally rewiring your brain. You're not just changing your financial behavior, you're changing the neural pathways that create your experience of money and possibility. The frequencies woven throughout this audio have been supporting this rewiring process, working with your subconscious mind to create new patterns of abundance thinking. Trust that this process is ongoing, even when you're not consciously aware of it. Trone. The journey from scarcity to abundance thinking is not a destination, but an ongoing practice. Every day offers new opportunities to choose abundance over scarcity, possibility over limitation, strategic thinking over survival reactions. As you move forward, carry with you the understanding that your financial reality is created not just by external circumstances, but by the internal patterns of thought and perception that either perpetuate scarcity or generate abundance. The brain you have today is not the brain you're stuck with forever. With understanding, practice, and patience, you can rewire your neural pathways to support the financial life you truly desire. Thank you for taking this journey into the psychology of scarcity. May you find abundance not just in your bank account, but in your relationship with money, with possibility, and with your own capacity for growth and transformation. The gentle frequencies embedded in this audio will continue their work long after the words have ended. Trust the process. Your subconscious mind is listening, learning, and rewiring itself for abundance even now.